The cafe buzzed with quiet conversations and the occasional clinking of cups, its warm glow a stark contrast to the bustling streets outside. Robert Downey Jr., almost unrecognizable in a plain black hoodie and faded jeans, pushed open the door, a soft chime announcing his arrival. The simplicity of his attire, coupled with the way he tucked himself into the space, made him look like any other patron stopping for a quick coffee. He paused at the door, stepping aside for an elderly woman juggling several shopping bags. "Let me help you with that," he said, his voice measured and kind as he reached out to steady her wobbling load. "Why, thank you, young man," she replied, her eyes twinkling as she caught sight of his face. For a brief moment, recognition flickered, but the actor's unassuming demeanor seemed to disarm her. She shuffled toward the counter, leaving Robert to slip further into the cafe. Settling into a quiet corner, he placed a leather-bound notebook on the table. Its pages, creased and well-worn, hinted at countless musings and untold stories. He waved at a waitress, ordering a simple black coffee without fuss. Around him, no one seemed to notice or care, just how he preferred it. Across the room, however, someone did notice. Henry Blackstone, a slick, sharp-suited entertainment executive, glanced up from his laptop, the glow of the screen reflecting off his designer glasses. His perfectly tailored navy blue blazer and polished demeanor exuded power, the kind that demanded attention in every room he entered. He recognized Robert immediately, though it took him a second to believe it. The star's casual appearance, almost anonymous amidst the hustle and bustle of the cafe, seemed incongruous with the image of the larger-than-life celebrity Henry was used to seeing on magazine covers and red carpets. "Well, if it isn't Hollywood's golden boy," Henry murmured under his breath, a smirk creeping onto his lips. The words weren't loud, but they were deliberate, carrying just enough weight to be overheard by the couple sitting at the table beside him. They turned briefly in Robert's direction, then quickly back to their conversation. Henry leaned back in his chair, studying the actor like a chess player, analyzing an opponent's move. It wasn't every day you saw someone like Robert Downey Jr. in a setting so ordinary. To Henry, this was an anomaly, one he couldn't resist, dissecting. After all, he thrived on power dynamics, on recognizing opportunities to assert dominance in both personal and professional interactions. This was just another moment to feed his ever-growing ego. As Robert sipped his coffee and began jotting something in his notebook, Henry's curiosity got the better of him. He closed his laptop with an exaggerated flourish, drawing a few glances from nearby tables. Straightening his tie, he decided to approach. Henry wasn't one for subtleties, and his entrance into conversations often felt more like a staged performance. He strutted across the cafe, his designer loafers clicking against the polished wooden floor. "Excuse me," he said, stopping just short of Robert's table, his tone laced with mock politeness. "I couldn't help but notice it's not every day we see someone of your stature in a place like this. Taking a break from saving the world, are we?" Robert glanced up, his expression calm but unreadable. His pen hovered over the notebook for a moment before he set it down. "Something like that," he said simply, his tone neither defensive nor inviting. Henry chuckled as though he'd heard a particularly amusing joke. "I have to say, it's refreshing. Seeing a big star like you just blending in, no entourage, no cameras, it's almost, what's the word I'm looking for, quaint." The words hung in the air, heavy with condescension. A few patrons glanced in their direction, sensing the shift in energy. Robert didn't flinch, didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Feel free to join me," Robert said, his voice so even that it disarmed Henry's carefully curated bravado for a fraction of a second. Henry hesitated, but only briefly. He wasn't one to turn down an invitation, especially not when it came with the promise of being the center of attention. "Don't mind if I do," he said, sliding into the seat with the confidence of someone who assumed they belonged everywhere. The tension in the cafe shifted as the two men sat across from each other. Henry's smirk remained, but Robert's quiet confidence was beginning to draw more notice than the executive's calculated swagger. The waitress approached with a refill for Robert's coffee, her steps hesitant as she glanced at the two men. The contrast between them was striking. Robert, relaxed, scribbling in his notebook with an air of quiet purpose, and Henry leaning back with his arms crossed, exuding the self-assured smugness of someone accustomed to controlling every conversation. "Another cup for you?" she asked Robert, her voice polite but laced with curiosity. "Yes, please," he replied with a gentle smile. Then, with a glance at Henry's empty cup, he added, "And one for him too, my treat." Henry raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "How generous," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But I'll have to pass. I'm more of a triple shot espresso guy, not really a fan of the simple stuff." The waitress nodded awkwardly and retreated, leaving the two men in a bubble of palpable tension. Robert leaned back, folding his arms casually, the corners of his mouth curving into the faintest hint of a smile. He seemed entirely unfazed by Henry's attempts to rattle him. "So?" Henry began, leaning forward with a predatory glint in his eye. "What's a guy like you doing here? You know, this isn't exactly the kind of place I'd picture for Hollywood royalty. Where's the entourage? The sunglasses? The screaming fans?" Robert shrugged, his fingers tracing the edges of his notebook. "Just needed a quiet place to think," he said. "Places like this have a way of putting things in perspective." Henry snorted. "Perspective? Sure, I get it. Nothing like a good cup of black coffee to make you forget the millions of dollars and private jets waiting outside." A ripple of amusement passed through the patrons seated nearby, though whether they were laughing with Henry or at him was unclear. Robert remained serene, his gaze fixed on the notebook in front of him. "Perspective isn't about forgetting," Robert said finally, his voice steady but firm. "It's about remembering what matters." The simplicity of the statement seemed to catch Henry off guard, but he quickly masked it with a chuckle. "Profound," he said, drawing out the word as if mocking a child's attempt at philosophy. "You've really got this whole everyman act down, don't you?" "I'm not acting," Robert replied, meeting Henry's gaze for the first time. There was no hostility in his expression, only a calm intensity that seemed to cut through the executive's bravado. Henry shifted slightly in his chair, his smirk faltering for just a moment before he recovered. "Fair enough," he said. "But don't get me wrong, I respect it. The humility, the whole man of the people thing. It's good PR, if nothing else." Robert's lips twitched in what might have been a smile, but he didn't respond. Instead, he returned his attention to his notebook, his pen moving across the page with deliberate precision. The gesture seemed to irk Henry, who thrived on being the center of attention. "So, what are you writing?" Henry asked, his tone casual but probing. "Another blockbuster script, or maybe just autographing the page for the next lucky fan who walks by." Robert didn't look up. "Notes," he said simply. "Notes? About what?" For the first time, Robert hesitated. His pen paused mid-word, and his expression softened. "Life," he said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "Moments like these." Henry leaned back, a sardonic smile playing on his lips. "You mean moments where a washed-up executive tries to bait a Hollywood star over coffee?" A hush fell over the cafe. Several patrons turned their heads, their curiosity now openly directed at the two men. Robert set his pen down and looked at Henry, his gaze calm yet piercing. "Moments where people show you who they are," Robert said, "and where you decide who you're going to be in return." The room seemed to hold its breath. Henry opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a rare loss for words. The weight of Robert's statement hung in the air, challenging not just Henry, but everyone within earshot to reflect on their own behavior. For the first time, Henry looked unsettled. He glanced around the cafe as though noticing for the first time that he wasn't performing for an audience but being silently judged by one. Robert picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, and returned to his notebook. The tension in the air was almost tangible as Henry shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his facade beginning to crack ever so slightly. The cafe's atmosphere grew heavier, the soft murmurs of other patrons fading into the background as the exchange between Robert and Henry seemed to pull all attention toward their table. Henry crossed his arms, leaning slightly forward, as though preparing for a decisive move in a game he was determined to win. "You know," Henry said, his voice casual but with an edge of provocation, "moments like these are fascinating. They really show you how people perceive themselves. Some folks live in a bubble, thinking their simplicity makes them profound. Others," he gestured to himself with a smug smile, "they embrace their ambition, make no apologies for it." Robert, his pen poised over the page, didn't react immediately. His calm was unwavering, like a stone in the middle of a rushing stream. The lack of response only seemed to irritate Henry further, his grin tightening at the edges. "And let me guess," Henry continued, his voice rising slightly, "you're one of those people who think staying grounded somehow makes you better than the rest of us, as if sitting in a cafe with a notebook and a black coffee gives you some moral high ground." Robert finally set his pen down, his gaze steady as he looked at Henry. "I'm not trying to be better than anyone, but if ambition means tearing people down to feel important, then maybe I'm okay without it." The subtle rebuke landed like a ripple turning into a wave. A few heads turned, some customers pretending not to listen while their curiosity betrayed them. Henry, sensing the attention, straightened in his chair, his smile now a thin veneer of control. "You've got a way with words," he said, forcing a laugh. "I'll give you that. But let's not pretend you're some kind of saint. You've played the game just like everyone else. What's the difference between us, really?" Robert tilted his head slightly, as though genuinely considering the question. "The difference," he said, "is what you're willing to lose in the process. Your integrity, your peace, those things don't come back once you trade them away." Henry's smirk faltered, but only for a heartbeat. "Integrity doesn't pay the bills, my friend. You think all the success you've had came without sacrifice, without compromises." Before Robert could respond, the waitress returned, placing a steaming cup of espresso in front of Henry. "On the house," she said, her voice hesitant, her eyes darting nervously between the two. "Men, see?" Henry said, lifting the cup in mock salute. "Even she gets it. Sometimes you take what you can, no questions asked." Robert's silence was deafening. He leaned back slightly, his hands resting on the notebook as he observed Henry with an expression that wasn't judgmental but deeply contemplative. The tension between them was almost tangible, a silent battle of philosophies playing out in full view of the cafe's audience. Henry set the cup down, his bravado cracking just enough to reveal a flicker of frustration. "Look, I'm not trying to make this personal," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. but you don't get to where I am or where you are without stepping on a few toes.
That's just the way the world works. Robert leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. Maybe the world works that way because people like you decide it should. The words cut through the room like a knife. For a moment,
Henry seemed genuinely taken aback, his carefully constructed facade slipping as he searched for a retort. Around them, the cafe's patrons had stopped pretending not to listen. The quiet rustle of newspapers and clinking of cups had ceased entirely, replaced by an almost eerie stillness. Henry's grin returned, though it was thinner now, less confident. You know, for someone who claims not to play the game, you've got a real knack for taking the high road. But let's be honest, you wouldn't be sitting here if you didn't have some skin in it. What's your angle? What's the big takeaway you're scribbling in that little notebook of yours? Robert's eyes flickered to the notebook, then back to Henry. It's not about angles. It's about understanding. Understanding what? People, choices, the things that make us who we are. The simplicity of the answer seemed to unnerve Henry more than any insult could have. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. Instead, he looked down at his untouched espresso, the steam curling into the air between them like a fragile thread. The silence stretched, charged with the weight of everything unsaid. Robert, unbothered, returned to his notebook, his pen moving steadily across the page. The room, once again, seemed to revolve around the table where two men sat on opposite sides of an unspoken divide. The hum of the cafe's background noise began to return as patrons shifted in their seats, resuming hushed conversations. Henry's polished exterior, once impenetrable, was now showing cracks as he swirled the untouched espresso in his cup, his movements slower, less certain. Across from him, Robert kept writing, his pen gliding across the page with an almost meditative rhythm. "You know," Henry said, suddenly, breaking the silence. "I used to think people like you were lucky, that the world just handed you things on a silver platter because you fit the image, because you had the charisma to make people believe in you." Robert paused, his pen hovering over the page, but he didn't look up. And now, Henry's laugh was sharp, almost bitter. "Now I realize it's all an act."
Even this, he gestured broadly, as if encompassing the cafe, the notebook, the moment. It's just another performance, isn't it? A way to keep the spotlight while pretending you don't want it. For the first time, Robert
met his gaze, his expression calm but unflinchingly direct. "Do you really believe that?" he asked. Henry hesitated, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. He opened his mouth to reply, but Robert continued before he could. "Because if you do, then maybe it's not me you're questioning, maybe it's yourself." The room seemed to shrink around them as the words settled in the air. Henry's smirk faltered, and for a brief moment, something vulnerable flickered in his eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a defensive edge. "You don't know anything about me," Henry said, his voice lower now, less performative. "You sit here, writing in your little notebook, acting like you've got it all figured out. But you don't know what it's like to fight for every inch, to claw your way to the top when no one's rooting for you." Robert leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, but his gaze unwavering. "You're right," he said. "I don't know your story, but I do know what it's like to lose everything." The quiet declaration hit Henry harder than he expected. His usual retorts, sharp and rehearsed, seemed to abandon him. "Lose everything?" he repeated, his tone skeptical but tinged with curiosity. "What could someone like you possibly know about that?" Robert didn't
answer right away. Instead, he closed his notebook carefully, running his fingers over the worn cover as if tracing the memories it held.
When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but the weight behind his words was unmistakable. "There was a time," Robert began, "when I had all the things you think matter: money, fame, power, and I lost them all. Not because someone took them from me, but because I let them consume me. I was so busy chasing what I thought I wanted that I didn't see what I was losing along the way." Henry frowned, leaning forward slightly. His interest piqued despite himself. "And what was that?" "Myself," Robert said simply. The simplicity of the statement silenced Henry, who sat back in his chair, his arms crossing tightly over his chest. He looked away, as if trying to escape the weight of Robert's words, but the truth in them clung to him like a shadow. "I had to start over," Robert continued, his voice softer now, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "I had to figure out what mattered, not to the world, but to me. And I realized it wasn't about climbing higher or proving anything to anyone. It was about finding peace with who I am, flaws and all." Henry stared at him, his facade of confidence crumbling just enough to reveal the cracks underneath. "And you think you found that? Peace?" he asked, the question sounding more like a challenge than genuine curiosity. "I think I'm getting closer," Robert replied, "but it's not something you find once and keep forever. It's a choice you make every day, a choice to let go of the things that don't serve you, no matter how shiny they might seem." The café seemed to hold its breath as Henry grappled with the revelation. Around them, the quiet murmur of voices and clinking dishes felt distant, almost irrelevant. Robert picked up his coffee, his movements unhurried, his calmness unshaken. Henry, for once, had nothing to say. Henry's fingers tapped a restless rhythm against the edge of his cup, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. He avoided Robert's gaze now, staring out the cafe window at the bustling street beyond. The executive, who once thrived on controlling every room he entered, now seemed subdued, his usual confidence dulled by the quiet power of Robert's words. "I'll admit," Henry said finally, his voice quieter than before, "I never thought about it like that. Letting go. I mean, everything I've ever done was about holding on, fighting to keep what I'd built, proving to everyone that I deserve to be where I am." Robert watched him, his expression patient, offering no judgment, only understanding. "And has it made you happy?" Henry's lips parted as if to respond, but the words didn't come immediately. He laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "Happy? I don't know if that's the right word. Successful? Sure. Respected? Maybe. But happy? That's different." "It is," Robert agreed, "and harder to measure. But it's worth pursuing." Henry leaned back, crossing his arms defensively. "Easy for you to say. You've already had your shot at the top. You've tasted it all, and now you can afford to step back and wax poetic about inner peace. Some of us don't have that luxury." Robert's gaze didn't waver. "It's not a luxury. It's a choice. And it's not easy for anyone, no matter where you're starting from." Henry looked down at his hands, his fingers curling into loose fists. The words hung between them, challenging him to reflect, to consider whether his relentless climb had come at a cost he wasn't willing to acknowledge. For the first time, he didn't have a clever retort, no calculated response to deflect the conversation back onto safer ground. "You know what's funny?" Henry said after a moment, his voice tinged with a self-deprecating edge. "I came over here thinking I'd put you in your place, remind you that the world doesn't revolve around humility and notebooks. And now you're questioning your own place in the world," Robert finished for him, his tone gentle, devoid of any triumph. Henry chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, Something like that. The cafe door chimed as new patrons entered, bringing a gust of cold air with them. Henry glanced toward the door, his gaze distant,
as if seeing something beyond the here and now. I spent so many years thinking the goal was to win, he said quietly. To be the best, to have it all.
But I don't think I ever stopped to ask what I was really chasing. Robert leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. It's not too late to ask. Henry's eyes flicked back to Robert, studying him as if searching for a hidden motive. You really believe that? That it's not too late? I do, Robert said, simply. But it's not about what I believe. It's about what you're willing to believe for yourself. The words seemed to strike a chord, and Henry fell silent, his thoughts turning inward. Around them, the cafe continued its gentle hum of activity, but the table they shared felt like a world unto itself, a quiet space where truths could be spoken without fear of judgment. After a long pause, Henry nodded, almost to himself. Maybe you're right. Maybe I've been so focused on proving my worth to everyone else that I forgot to prove it to myself. Robert smiled faintly, a glimmer of warmth in his otherwise calm demeanor. That's a good place to start. The silence that followed wasn't tense or uncomfortable, but reflective, a pause that allowed the weight of their conversation to settle. Henry's posture softened, his usual bravado replaced with something more genuine, more human. He glanced at the espresso cup in front of him, the steam long since dissipated, and finally took a sip. It's bitter, he said, with a slight grimace, but his tone carried a hint of humor. Figures. Robert chuckled softly. Some things are an acquired taste. Henry nodded, setting the cup down and meeting Robert's gaze with a newfound sincerity. Thanks for the coffee, for the perspective, for not telling me to get lost, Robert shrugged lightly. Everyone's on their own path. Sometimes we just need a reminder that we're allowed to change direction. The cafe felt lighter now, the tension that had filled the space, earlier replaced by a quiet sense of clarity. Henry leaned back in his chair, his arms resting on the table, his usual calculated demeanor stripped away. For once, he wasn't the man with all the answers, and he seemed oddly at peace with
that. I don't even know where to start, he said, his voice carrying an honesty that felt foreign to him. It's not like I can just wake up tomorrow and change everything. Robert nodded, his expression thoughtful. You don't
have to change everything all at once. Start small. Ask yourself one simple question. Does this make me better, or does it hold me back? Henry considered the words carefully, his brow furrowing slightly. You make it sound easy.
It's not, Robert admitted, but it's worth it.
Every step you take toward being the person you want to be is a step away from the person you don't. Henry let the idea sink in, his gaze drifting back to the window. Outside, the world carried on as usual, people hurrying along the sidewalk, unaware of the quiet transformation taking place inside. He watched them for a moment, then turned back to Robert, his expression softer now. What about you? Henry asked. What keeps you moving forward? Robert's lips curved into a faint smile. The understanding that every moment is an opportunity to learn, to grow, to be better than I was yesterday. That's all anyone can ask of themselves. Henry nodded slowly, as if the words had unlocked something within him. He glanced at the notebook sitting on the table, at its worn cover a testament to the countless thoughts and reflections it held. Do you ever share what you write in there? He asked, gesturing toward it. Sometimes, Robert replied, "but most of it's just for me. Writing helps me process, to make sense of things. It's less about sharing and more."
About understanding. Henry leaned back, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Maybe I should start doing that. Writing, might be better than just shouting into the void.
Robert chuckled softly. "It's a good place to start." The waitress returned, her movements careful as she cleared the empty cups from the table. "Anything else for you, gentlemen?" she asked, her tone lighter now, as if sensing the shift in energy. "No, we're good," Robert said, glancing at Henry, who nodded in agreement. As the waitress walked away, Henry stood, smoothing the front of his suit. He looked down at Robert, his expression thoughtful, almost hesitant. "I don't know if I'll ever figure it out," he said.
"But thanks for the reminder that I can try." Robert stood as well, extending a hand. "Trying's the hardest part. The rest will come." Henry took the offered hand, his grip firm but not overpowering. It was a handshake that
carried the weight of something unspoken, a truce, perhaps, or an understanding. As they released, Henry gave a small nod, the kind that didn't need words to convey its meaning. He walked to the door, pausing for a moment as the cold air rushed in. With one last glance back, he stepped outside, disappearing into the flow of people on the street. Robert watched him go, then returned to his seat, his notebook waiting. For him? Opening it, he picked up his pen and began to write. The world outside continued to hum with its usual rhythm, but inside the cafe, a quiet sense of possibility lingered, a reminder that even the smallest moments could spark the biggest changes